So I mentioned variables before. So this is kind of the foundation of programming languages. How do we store information? We need to store information when we're going to create programs, applications. Variables are the baseline way we can store information. What does variable mean? It means something that changes. Variables are a way of referring to a memory location used by Python, or basically any computer program. So when we define a variable, what we're doing is basically creating a map to a location used by Python where it stores something. In many programming languages, a variable is a symbolic name for a physical location. Think of it as a container. So on the right side of the screen, the bucket is our variable. We can put things inside the bucket like the value 42. If you look in the middle, you see in the white box, variable is assigned some expression. Now, of course, you say that says equals. Well, in programming, you're assigning the value to the variable, so it is an assignment. So, if we take our bucket and we dump 42 in it, how do we represent that programmatically? We say bucket is assigned the value 42. So a variable stores that assigned information. Then we can access it later on through its name. So if I want to print out what's inside bucket, I can just say print parentheses bucket parentheses. And this outputs the value of 42. So variables are very important. We can store information inside them. We can assign information to them. We can basically carry them through our code, and when we need them, we can dump them out. We can add to them, we can subtract from them, we can completely change them. That's why they're called variable. It means change. We can do anything with them we want, basically, within the rules of the Python programming language. So variables are very important. You need to come to terms with a variable before you can progress into really understanding any programming language. The easiest way I've come to think of it as a bucket. This is what I've taught students before, and they seem to understand this analogy. Some describe it as a bookshelf, where you're putting information on the shelf, and you're naming that shelf so you can go back and grab that information. I like to envision a bucket that I carry around with me through all my lines of code, and I can add, subtract, change the value that's inside the bucket, but still it's always with me. And Python knows what it is. The great thing about Python and some other languages is that Python specifically, you don't have to declare the variables in Python. What does this mean? If you've never heard a declaration of variables before, what in the world does that mean? It means that you don't have to define the type of information being stored in the variable. Whether it's an integer, a float, which is a decimal number, a string, which is a bunch of characters like my name is Tim. You don't have to tell Python that that's going to be stored in the variable. You can just create a bucket and dump some data in it, and Python is good with that. You also don't have to tell Python if you're going to change what kind of information is going to be in that bucket or in that variable. If I want to dump out my string and add a number, an integer inside my bucket, that's fine. Python doesn't care. It's great. Python automatically takes care of the physical representation for different data types. So we don't have to worry about it. In the square white box, you see bucket equals 42. This is from our other screen. What does bucket equal 42 mean? It means 42 is assigned to the bucket. In this case, the bucket variable is storing an integer, a number that's not a decimal. If I want to print the bucket, it outputs an integer value of 42. Now, I keep the same bucket, so I don't rename that variable. I just say bucket equals, and now quotes, and then some text inside of it. In this instance, my string of text. Now that bucket variable contains a string of characters. If I print the bucket now, it outputs that exact string of text that I added to it earlier. This change from integer to string does not cause an error in Python. It might in other languages, depending on what you're programming in. You can also override a value stored in a variable at any time. So it makes it really easy for us. We don't have to define the bucket and say integers only can fit in this bucket, or this bucket is for only strings, or this bucket is for only floats. We have a do-it-all, store anything kind of bucket we can use. And the bucket is what? It's a variable. Now, all variables don't have to be named bucket. That would make it awful. We'd have bucket 1, bucket 2, and you would have no idea what the code was doing. So we can name variables pretty much anything we want, but there are some rules. It must start with a letter or underscore. It cannot start with a digit, so it cannot start with numbers. You can have up to 256 total characters, but of course that would be ridiculous. It would be a very long name. I would say, unless very special circumstances, don't use all 256 characters to name your variable. Now, as long as it starts with a letter, you can include other letters, digits, underscores, dollar signs, etc. Now, this is different from some languages. Some languages must start every variable name with the dollar sign. But you cannot do this in Python because it must start with a letter. Very important. Students always seem to mess up when they're naming variables because they add spaces. And if Python sees a space, it will think that something else is starting. Your variable name has ended, and whatever comes after that should be something that Python can read and should fit within your line of code. So you cannot have spaces in variable names. What you can have is underscore or camel case. There are other ways to add multiple words together to describe your variable that allows you not to have to worry about spaces. And it cannot contain math symbols. Lastly, there are certain keywords that are reserved for Python, and you cannot use these as variable names. So, in the red box, red typically means what? Error. So, 49ers is assigned 42. This is illegal. Why? Because it starts with digits. So we cannot name a variable 49ers. Table plus chairs, well, that seems pretty descriptive, but it's illegal. It contains a mathematical symbol. Another way to do this would be table underscore chairs, and that would be legal. My space age is assigned the value of 44. Very bad. Don't do it. You'll get an error because it contains a space. Again, underscore. Or use camel case, which means I could rename this to lowercase m, lowercase y, uppercase a, g-e, lowercase. So it's all one word, but I can see that I'm meaning it as two words because I've capitalized the a in age. Parentheses, apple, parentheses. Again, illegal, you can't use parentheses. $sign foo equals bar. This is illegal because you cannot start with the $sign. Although it's allowed in languages like PHP and expected, Python does not work that way, so you cannot start it with the $sign. You can have a $sign at the end if it was foo $sign equals quotes bar close quotes. That would be fine, but you cannot start with the $sign. So remember these rules. Another important aspect of variable names in Python that you need to remember are that names and keywords are case sensitive. So as you see on the screen, if I do foo, capital B, R, foobar is assigned the value of Tim in quotes. And below that I do foobar with a lowercase b is assigned the value of Tim in quotes. These are two different variables. You'll have two buckets available to you. This will drive you mad if you accidentally capitalize a variable name in one instance of your code and then later on you don't capitalize it and something is wrong when you run it and you can't figure out why. It's almost impossible to find it. It'll drive you crazy because you just read over it and you see that the variable name is right and you don't really pay attention to that missing capital. So just make sure you know that variable names and keywords are case sensitive. It will save you much drama and headaches and swearing at your computer. So typically, as I mentioned, we can have 256 characters, but we don't want variables that long. Whatever you do, just do it consistently. Again, consistent, consistent, consistent. Also, comment the first instance so others will know what you've done and why you've done it. And what do I mean by this? Well, in Kolb, Chapter 2, under the heading Shorthand Naming Convention, this is what Kolb suggests, and I agree wholeheartedly. This is an easy way to do it. You can also shorten it even more. But say we have a variable that we're naming number of whatever. Well, we would shorten that to just be in whatever. And notice that he's using camel case. So again, what is camel case? The first character of the first word is lower. But then when we start the second word, we have an uppercase. Then when we start the third word, we have an uppercase. So you see that uppercase W. So once it becomes in whatever, we have lowercase n and then uppercase that second word. So a real example would be number of jelly beans becomes in jelly beans. Simple shorthand naming convention. Remember, the first time you do it, comment and say, I'm just using n to indicate number of. This will save you and others who read your code lots of time and headaches as they're trying to figure out what's happening. Now, why do we need to do shorthand? Well, you're going to have to type this more than once. So each time you type that name of the variable in your code, you introduce the possibility of mistakes. Say you misspell it. Say you accidentally forget to uppercase that second word or third word. Whatever. It's going to cause a problem. Also, it takes time. The longer the name of the variable, the more you have to type, the longer it takes you to get through that one line of code, and just can increase the amount of time you spend coding exponentially as you get into longer and longer blocks of code. So easy rule, make every variable name as short as possible, yet still explanatory. Okay?